What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to go over why code, not clicks, is best for the growth of your Salesforce org. Alright guys, so today we're going to go over why I believe code, not clicks, are best for the growth of your Salesforce org. And I want to go over two things really quick before we get into it. Number one, when I talk about clicks, I mean low-code automation tools, right? These can be things like workflow rules, process builders, flows, whatever else. There's tons and tons of things. I'll go over them more. But I'm primarily talking about workflow rules, process builders, and Lightning Flow. The second is that this is an opinion-based video. It's shaped based on my experiences across 47 Salesforce implementations over the last close to 7 years now. And my experiences are definitely different from your experiences. Now, you may agree with me, you may not agree with me. That's okay. Make sure that before you go out and try to tear down every automation tool, if that's what you want to do, to really assess your situation, right? And think about it from your perspective and what's best for your org, not just what's been my experience in the past. But let's get into it now that we've gone over those two things. There's a few things that have led me to this conclusion over the last nearly 7 years. The first thing I want to say is that in the beginning, I was pretty pro point and click low code development tools. I know plenty about Flow. I know how it works. I know how to create them. I know how to set them up. I know how to make Lightning web components for them, all that kind of stuff. And there are some very sparing situations where I would maybe even suggest them. But there's very few these days. And I used to love them, okay? I used to think, wow, I don't have to write as much code here, and that's wonderful. It can save me time, it can save the client I'm working for money, all those kind of things. But here's what has happened over the last several years since I originally thought those things. I have been brought in to projects or been a part of projects where I've implemented these tools and they reached their lifespan. And they typically reach their lifespan around the point at which you're, in my experience again, around the point where your org hits around 500 internal users. Because at that point, you've got typically a lot of people in there with a lot of competing interests, potentially multiple apps, bunch of different things. But basically your org is starting to grow. People are making more and more records. They're doing more and more things. They want more and more functionality, blah, 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 whatever. And there's a lot of limits that you don't necessarily know until you run into them, or unless you're a very diligent reader and you read all of them for every single automation tool. But at some point in your org's growth span or life cycle, whatever, as long as your org keeps growing, which I hope it does, I hope your business flourishes and all those things anyway, you will run into these problems. You will hit limits. Things will not be possible with just the out-of-the-box screen flows or whatever else. And at that point, you have to start refactoring these flows into code, right? So many times I've been brought in to projects, and my primary goal was to basically refactor an existing low-code tool into code so that it actually worked. That could be in the form of taking a big chunk of a flow and making it invocable Apex so it could actually do what it needed to do. It could be taking the whole flow and putting it into a trigger because that's the best thing. But here's the truth of it all. I know flows. I also know code. And if somebody had just written bad code to begin with, code that works but was bad and just not great, and I needed to refactor it, it would have taken me 1/10 of the time to do it than going into a flow and refactoring it. And the reason I say that is because I'm sure, as most of you know, if you go into a flow, you've got to click on the nodes, you got to figure out what the nodes do, then you've got to, figure out how to restructure those nodes so they work with Apex or in Apex or whatever else. And that is so much more time consuming than if somebody had written code that works, that was bad, that needed to be refactored, than, clicking through all that stuff, regardless of whether it's a workflow or a process builder or a flow. So the time to refactor is always, I think, again, based on my experience, always shorter for refactoring code than it is for refactoring a flow that has reached its lifespan, which will happen if your org is growing. At least as of today, which is October 17th, 2021. The second thing that I think is worth bringing up is that in the last almost 7 years of my career in Salesforce, Salesforce has changed the automation tools several times. So in the beginning, when I started, it was all about workflows, and it was kind of about Flow Builder, but Flow Builder was pretty slow and kind of ugly before Lightning Flow Builder. And so then they brought in Process Builder, right? And everybody's like, yeah, Process Builder is great. We build lots of things in Process Builders. And, well, Process Builders have tons of limits. I'm not going to get into that. And we've all figured out, I think, over the course of time, they're not that great. But at a certain point, when Salesforce figured that out too, they decided, all right, we're going to introduce Lightning Flow, and we're going to deal with that. And now, over the last year especially, Salesforce has been putting an enormous amount of work into Lightning Flow, and it's looking like maybe they will actually stick to this low-code automation tool. But I don't know that any of us know that. And process builders and workflows are apparently officially going to be deprecated soon, so at some point you're going to have to refactor all of that into a flow or code. And if you asked me, because of the history there, along with the things I just talked about, I would go the code route, even if it's not beautiful code and you're not a super awesome developer. It doesn't really matter, I guess is what I'm saying. I would go the code route. And the last thing that I kind of want to bring up that is important. So we've just talked about eventually you'll hit limits and you got to refactor it to some extent, and it is almost always going to be faster to refactor code than it is to refactor automation processes, the low-code automation processes, which will save you time and money to start getting what it is you actually want out of the whole thing. And we just talked about how Salesforce has changed their automation tools multiple times, right? The last thing is this, which, let me bring it up here. This makes sense, but this is a knowledge article from Salesforce themselves, right? It says, for each object, use one automation tool. And what they mean by use one automation tool per object is that you either need to use an Apex trigger or a workflow or a process builder or a Lightning Flow for any of your automations, right? So why pick the ones that are going to fail you eventually? I mean, yeah, initially maybe it gets you off the ground running quicker or cheaper or whatever else. And maybe that is the best choice for you at that moment in time based on your budget and your skill set and all that kind of stuff, right? Maybe it is. But what I can tell you is that if your org truly does grow, eventually you'll hit limits, eventually there will become a problem, and eventually it will cost you way more money to refactor those than if you would have just written the little amount of code you needed to do pretty much the same thing. So, if you're only supposed to use one automation tool, my suggestion would be stick with the trigger because it's got the best. It's got the highest limits. It's going to be able to do the most for you, and it'll be the easiest to refactor, even if it's done in the not prettiest way the first time around. So, yeah, and if you don't know why they suggest using one automation tool, it's for good reasons. I would suggest it too. It's a wonderful choice, in my opinion, because if you're not familiar with the order of operations in Salesforce, what you can get yourself into is your Apex trigger runs, then your workflow rules run, and they update things, and then maybe a process builder runs and it updates things, and then those re-invoke the trigger, and you get into these loop situations. Sometimes you can get yourself into an infinite loop situation and you didn't even know it, and it can really, really, really slow down your operation speeds if you start using all these different automation tools all at the same time on the same object. So all right, so with all that said, and with my personal opinion based on my personal experiences been made public here, I guess. Number one, Salesforce still has an amazing product that saves you an enormous amount of time, regardless of whether you use a trigger or low-code automation tools, in my opinion. I mean, so much time is saved from a development perspective, even without the low-code tools that I'm personally suggesting to typically avoid. There are situations where it is your best choice, but there are few. I will explain them really quick just so that I don't sound too biased here, right? The first is I have found that in some situations, and I have discussed this with multiple people who are probably more, even they're more talented than myself at UI stuff, and have made excellent suggestions on how to leverage flows in certain situations. If you're building a multi-page Lightning Web component, it can be beneficial to wrap that multi-page Lightning Web component in a flow to handle the pagination aspect of it and the moving of data between the pages. Now, there's problems with the moving of data between the pages because of the way that the flow interprets the data and the Lightning Web component interprets the data. It can be a huge pain. So I actually would suggest using session storage or something like that to deal with it. But regardless, multi-page Lightning Web components are good candidates for a flow, potentially. The other situation in which low-code automation tools might be your best choice is when you're on a really, really low budget and you cannot convince anyone on your team to learn how to write code. I have not been on a team that small, and obviously if I was on the team, I like to code, so I would have developed it. But I know there are many, many projects out there like that, and sometimes you have to start this way. So don't get me wrong, if you have no ability to write code at all and there's nobody interested in learning how to write code for your org, these tools can absolutely deliver something for you that works at that moment of time without somebody having to learn a whole bunch of code. And it's typically for cheaper costs because developers are often more expensive than administrators. So in that situation, would I also suggest it? Potentially. But don't let it grow too much. Okay? At some point, you're going to start growing. Your org is going to start taking off, or your business or whatever, and you're going to get more, a bigger influx of cash. My suggestion is that at that point in time, when you see and you know that your org is going to grow, hire a developer to start writing the code. Okay? Getting off the ground, running with the low-code tools, perfectly fine, but don't stay with it for too long, or it can be a monster to unravel eventually when you have to. The last couple scenarios that I would potentially suggest a low-code tool for are, number one, if you have a very simple UI that you need to build that doesn't warrant the use of maybe more than 20 to 30 nodes in a screen flow. Sometimes you have really, really simple UIs that you just want to get out and a screen flow can actually handle. And, by all means, go on ahead and make it happen. But if it starts to expand much more past that, you get into a bunch of subflows or you get into the 50 to 100 node route. It can be really, really challenging to maintain, even if you're really good at flows. So I would suggest at that point thinking about refactoring them into Lightning Web Components that can sit in the flow to kind of simplify it and make it a little easier to deal with. And the second thing is emailing. You can do emailing in code, and sometimes that is the best choice. But doing emails in these low-code tools is pretty simple. It's pretty easy to deal with, and normally works out pretty well. Sometimes that's not true based on your situation, but again, I've found that emailing has been an okay place to use these tools. So, all right. I think that covers everything. Again, this varies based on your situation, and yes, if you have no developer, and you have no way to fund the cost of a developer, then certainly go the low-code route, like we just discussed. But if you can, in my personal opinion, based on lots of different things, even bad code is easier to deal with refactoring than having to undo a flow after it reaches its breaking point, basically. So, with that, I guess I'll end this, and hopefully I haven't, made anybody too upset out there. This is, again, just my opinion that I've found to be true in my experience over several years, almost 7 years in Salesforce. So take it or leave it, but I hope it helps somebody out there. And please make sure to assess your situation before you start going out and doing anything. Don't go out and start just destroying your low-code tools and refactoring them. Make sure that it's actually warranted, that it truly is the best choice. If you've already built them, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But anyway, those are my feelings on it. Hopefully it's helped. Now there's another opinion out there. And anyway, I'll see you guys next week when I make, or really actually in about a day, when I release a considerably less opinion-based video. I hope. Anyway, I'll see you guys later, and thanks for watching.